الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. The topic of the first lecture is somato-sensory receptors and the sensation of touch, pressure and temperature. The objectives of this lecture include: describe what is the meaning of the sensory receptor, how the sensory receptor act as a transducer to change the stimulus into action potential, what is the definition of the stimulus, how modality encoded by a labeled line code, how can we define the intensity of the stimulus, duration encoded in the charge pattern of rapidly and slowly adapting receptors, how the stimulus location is dependent on body map in the brain, describe what is the lateral inhibition mechanism, what do we mean by the term adaptation of a sensory receptors, and lastly the role of the dorsal column medial meniscus system as well as the primary and secondary somatic sensory areas. Sensation. Sensation is defined as the conscious perception of a particular feeling initiated by stimulation of a certain type of receptor by its adequate stimulus. So we have conscious perception of a particular feeling, and this feeling is initiated by stimulation of a receptor by its adequate stimulus. We classify the sensation into general sensation and special sensation. The general sensation are classified into somatic, visceral and organic, and the special sense include vision, hearing, taste, smell and sense of equilibrium. If we go to the organic sensation, it includes hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and mostly these sensations are perceived at the level of the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. We have visceral sensation carried or coming from viscera and carried by the autonomic afferents, while the somatic sensation that's carried by the somatic afferent to the somatic nervous system are classified into mechanoreceptive sensation, pain sensation, thermal sensation. And if we look to the mechanoreceptive, we classify them into tactile sensation that is dependent on the touch, like touch, pressure and vibration, and we have the proprioceptive sensation or the sense of position and movement. So that is the classification of sensation. Sensory system and the sensory receptors. The sensory system is a part of the nervous system or the division of the nervous system concerned with the perception, conduction, and integration of sensory inputs from the external or the internal environment. And the sensory unit is formed of single sensory axon, its peripheral branches, and its connected receptors. So this is a sensory unit. Sensory unit consists of the axon and its peripheral branches with the receptors present at the termination of these branches. We have the term which is called the receptive field. The receptive field is the area from which the stimulus causes action potential generation. The receptive field of the sensory unit is the area from which the stimulus is going to produce action potential generation. So we define the sensory system as the division of the nervous system that's concerned with perception, conduction and integration of the sensory information from the internal or external environment, and we define also the receptive field. Also we have the definition or the meaning of the sensory unit. It is a single sensory axon with its peripheral branches and the connected receptors. Sensory receptors. The sensory receptors are specialized microscopic structures present at the peripheral termination of the sensory neurons or afferent neurons. Again, sensory receptors are defined as specialized microscopic structure located at the peripheral termination of the sensory neurons. What are their functions? They are detectors. They detect the changes in the external or internal environment. Also, they are transducers. They transform any form of energy into a receptor potential, into a change in the membrane potential or a change in its voltage resting membrane potential, known as the receptor potential. So the receptors are defined as specialized microscopic structure located at the peripheral termination of the sensory neurons. They detect the changes in the internal or external environment and transform this energy, which may be either mechanical, thermal, or electromagnetic, into a receptor potential. What is the excitability, or what is the definition of excitability? Excitability is defined as the ability of the receptor to respond to a stimulus, and usually the response is known as the receptor potential or the generator potential. So when you stimulate the receptor by its adequate stimulus, it produces a state of partial depolarization, and this state of partial depolarization is usually known as the receptor potential or the generator potential. The receptor potential is usually generated or started in the unmyelinated receptor region, and when the receptors are stimulated, the receptor potential, if it is strong enough and reach to the threshold, it will generate action potential. So according to the intensity of the stimulus, the minimal stimulus, or the stimulus which is capable of producing a receptor potential that reach to the threshold, is going to be conducted as an action potential, while the subminimal stimuli who couldn't produce a strong receptor potential will not be felt. Why? Because they are going to generate receptor potential only without the generation of action potential. All the receptors are stimulated mainly by depolarization, except the photoreceptors is stimulated by hyperpolarization. The mechanism of stimulation of the receptors. The mechanism of generation of receptor potential is different from a receptor to another one. For example, if we go to the mechanoreceptor, the mechanism of stimulation of the mechanoreceptors is dependent on the application of a mechanical stimulus, and this mechanical stimulus usually produces deformity of the receptor and this deformity will change the membrane permeability by stretching of the membrane, allowing the entry of the positively charged ions, producing depolarization. On the other hand, if we go to the olfactory receptors, which is a chemoreceptor stimulated by odorant substances that is capable of binding with the olfactory receptors, opening or activating a certain types of G protein coupled receptors, increasing the membrane permeability to sodium and generating the process of depolarization. But if you remember the photoreceptors that is sensitive to light, they are stimulated by the photons of light that hydrolyze the photosensitive pigment and changing or activating the phosphodiesterase enzyme. And when the phosphodiesterase enzyme become active, it hydrolyzes the cyclic GMP, closing the cyclic GMP gated channels, and this will produce closure of the sodium channels, producing hyperpolarization. That is the mechanism. So if we look here, we have different types of receptors, and each type of receptor has a specific type in generating the receptor potential, has a specific mechanism in generating the receptor potential. What are the properties of the receptor potential? The characteristics of the receptor potential: number one, it is graded. The receptor potential is directly proportionate with the intensity of the stimulus. The receptor potential is directly proportionate to the intensity or with the intensity of the stimulus. Number two, passive localized spread. The receptor potential is conducted electrotonically with decrement. It is not like the action potential. It's conducted with a decrease in its force until reaching to the impulse generator area, which is the first node of Ranvier. This means that the receptor potential is going to be conducted with passive decrement of its force until it reaches to the first node of Ranvier. It is the site of the generation of the action potential. Summation. It can be summated either spatially or temporally. It can be summated either spatially or temporally. Spatially means with other potential at the same time and at different sites. At the same time and at different sites. Or temporally with other potential following it at the same site. Following it at the same site. So we have some sort of summation. This means that multiple receptor potential can be summated together to generate the action potential. Does not obey all or none law. Does not obey all or none law. Has no refractory period. Has no refractory period. Cannot be blocked by local anesthesia. Cannot be blocked by local anesthesia. So if we would like to list the properties of the receptor potential, it is graded. The receptor potential is directly proportionate with the intensity of the stimulus. It's conducted with passive localized spread. It can be summated. It has no refractory period. Cannot be blocked by local anesthesia. Does not obey all or none law. What is the role of the receptor in detection of the stimulus intensity? The receptors can detect the intensity of the stimulus and play a role in detection of the stimulus intensity by number one, the frequency code. What is the meaning of the frequency code? Increasing the intensity of the stimulus leads to increase in the receptor potential generation. And consequently increase the rate of the charge, so any increase in the intensity of the stimulus is associated with increase in the rate of the charge. This is known as the frequency code. The second mechanism by which the receptor can detect the intensity of the stimulus is known as recruitment of the receptors. What is the meaning of recruitment of the receptors? Once we increase the intensity of the stimulus, the number of stimulated receptors will increase. So the intensity of the stimulus can be detected at the level of the receptors through number one, the frequency code, number two, the number of stimulated receptors or the recruitment of the receptors. Here, if we look to the pressure applied on the skin receptors and looking for the rate of the charge and the action potential generated from the receptor, as the pressure is increasing, the number of receptors potential and action potential generated is going to increase in the frequency, and that is the relation between the intensity of the stimulus and the action potential generation, which is defined by the frequency code. Okay. Can you classify the receptors according to adaptation? But we have to define what is the meaning of adaptation. Adaptation or adaptation is the decline in the frequency of the charge of the nerve impulses despite of constant stimulation. For example, we have here the duration of the stimulus, and we have here the impulses discharged from the receptors per second, and if we look here, that is the duration of the stimulus. We have a group of receptors that show rapid decline in the frequency of the charge. This means that they discharge with the start of stimulation and then stop to discharge, while we have another types of receptors that going to discharge as long as the stimulus is present. So we can classify the receptors according to their rate of adaptation into slowly adapting receptors and rapidly adapting receptors. Rapidly adapting receptors, which are the phasic receptors, and slowly adapting receptors, which are the tonic receptors. So again, what is the definition of adaptation? Adaptation is the decline in the frequency of the charge of nerve impulses despite of constant stimulation. The rapidly adapting receptors are showing rapid decline in the frequency of the charge, while slowly adapting receptors continue to discharge with constant stimulation. They are showing limited adaptation. Here, the rapidly adapting receptor usually important in detecting the onset of the stimulus, offset of the stimulus, and the change of the velocity of the stimulus. The rapidly adapting receptors are important in detecting the start of stimulation, end of stimulation, and the change in the velocity of the stimulus. While the slowly adapting receptors detect the onset of stimulus and the duration of the stimulus. As the stimulus is going to continue, they are going to surcharge, so they are important in detecting the duration of the stimulus. Examples of the slowly adapting receptors include proprioceptors. They continue to discharge to help in the equilibrium, to help the brain to identify the position of different parts of the body, and this is important for the process of programming and planning for the voluntary movement. You cannot perform a voluntary movement without knowing the position of your joints, without the position of your limbs. Pain receptors also are considered as a non-adapting or slowly adapting receptors. They continue to charge to avoid the injurious agents. We have also baroreceptors. They continue to charge to regulate the arterial blood pressure. So we classify the receptors according to their adaptation into rapidly adapting receptors and slowly adapting receptors. Then we will go to the neural coding of sensory information. What is the meaning of the neural coding of sensory information? For example, if I would like to tell you that the visual receptors or the photoreceptors, when they are stimulated, they discharge action potential, and this action potential reach to the cerebral cortex. How can the cerebral cortex know this action potential is denoting vision? On the other hand, you feel cold and your thermoreceptors discharge action potential, informing the brain there is exposure to cold. How can the brain identify this action potential is related to cold? So we have something which is called the coding of sensory information, which means the ability of the brain to identify the locality, the modality, and the intensity of the stimulus. How can the brain differentiate between the different action potential coming from the different receptors? That is pain, that's cold, that is hot, that is, for example, proprioception, that's stretch, that is vibration. So we have something called the ability of the brain to identify the locality, modality, and intensity, which is called coding. We will go firstly to the sensation modality or the type of the stimulus. The brain can identify the type of the stimulus by two mechanisms. The first mechanism is what is the specificity of the receptor. That is the peripheral mechanism. The peripheral mechanism for identification of the nature of the stimulus is specificity of the receptor. This occurs at the level of the receptor, and this means that each type of receptor is highly sensitive to only one type of stimuli called adequate stimulus. Each type of receptors is highly sensitive to only one type of stimuli called adequate stimulus. For example, photoreceptors are stimulated exclusively by light. Olfactory receptors are stimulated by odorant substances that are volatile, water soluble, and lipid soluble. For example, taste receptors are stimulated by the tastent substances, that is including salt, sweet, bitter, sour, and umami. All type of receptors are specific to only one type of stimuli. Why? Because the receptor have a low threshold to its adequate stimulus. It can be stimulated by the lowest intensity of the stimulus. It has a low threshold. The meaning of low threshold, it can be stimulated with the minimal intensity of this stimulus. The second mechanism is a central mechanism which is known as the labeled line principle. Labeled line principle. What is the meaning of a labeled line principle? Labeled line principle means each type of sensation has a particular afferent and a separate pathway to reach to specific sensory area in the cerebral cortex. This means that all the sensory pathways are coming from the receptors and charging to the brain by different ways. So the sensation is felt when its specific pathway coming from the receptor is activated and the corresponding area in the cortex is also activated. This means labeled line principle. Each type of sensation has what? Number one, a particular afferent pathway, and this particular afferent pathway is separate between touch, between pain, between thermal sensation. Each type of sensation has a specific pathway to reach to a specific area in the cerebral cortex. And what is the role of the cerebral cortex is going to differentiate between this. This is known as the labeled line principle. Means specific pathway for different sensory modalities in the central nervous system. Specific pathways for different sensory modalities in the central nervous system. So here we can identify the nature of the stimulus. Going to identification of the intensity of the stimulus. How can the brain identify or differentiate between the stimuli with different intensities? We have the intensity discrimination. It is the ability of the brain to detect the intensity of the stimulus, and the mechanism of identification is dependent on a peripheral mechanism coming from the receptor. If you remember, the rate of the charge, which is a frequency code, and the recruitment of the receptors. When the stimulus intensity increase, we are going to stimulate more receptors. So that is the peripheral mechanism for the identification of the intensity of the stimulus. The central mechanism is known as central facilitation lateral inhibition. So we have peripheral mechanism, which is the frequency code and the recruitment of the receptors, and we have the central mechanism, which is the central facilitation lateral inhibition. What is the meaning of the central facilitation lateral inhibition mechanism? The stronger sensory input are enhanced and the weaker inputs are inhibited. For example, we have here a pencil touching a piece of the skin. We have a stimulation of this receptive field of 3 sensory units, but we have one maximally stimulated, and the peripheral sensory units are not stimulated by the same degree. The stronger input coming to the central nervous system will show facilitation, will show more stimulation, more excitation, while the less stimulated, the weaker sensory inputs is going to be inhibited by something called the lateral inhibition mechanism. We have lateral inhibitory neurons. These lateral inhibitory neurons present in the central nervous system, producing the central facilitation mechanism and the lateral inhibition to produce what? Focusing the sensory cortex with the strong stimuli. Focusing of the sensory cortex with the strong stimulus. This is known as the central facilitation lateral inhibition mechanism. Central facilitation lateral inhibition mechanism. So how can we detect the intensity of the stimulus? By the peripheral mechanism and central mechanism, and the central mechanism is known as central facilitation lateral inhibition. Detection of the locality of the stimulus. Detection of the locality or locality discrimination. The ability of the brain to detect the site of the stimulus, the site of the stimulus. And we have the somatotopic mapping. The somatotopic mapping of the body or the skin of the body is presented over the primary somatic sensory area, and each receptor on the body surface is represented on the cerebral cortex. There is a precise anatomical relationship between the receptors on the skin and the sensory neuron in the cerebral cortex. So when you stimulate any point in the skin, this is going to stimulate a specific neuron in the cerebral cortex, and you are going to project to the site of stimulation. You are going to project this stimulation is coming from, for example, if you are going to examine for sensation in the hand of your brother, you have, for example, the tip of your pen and touching the skin of his arm with his closed eyes, or after asking him to close his eyes, and you are going to ask, can you localize the site of the stimulus? He is going to produce pinpointing. He is going to show you that is the point to touch it. How can this occur? Stimulation of the skin receptor send the impulses to the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex is going to detect the site of the stimulus by the law of projection. At the same time, if we are going to remove the vault of the skull and go to the primary somatic sensory area and stimulate, for example, this part of the primary somatic sensory area, what's going? The subject is awake and they will tell you that the sensation is coming from the face, coming from the cheek. How can this occur? By the law of projection. He was going to feel the sensation as it coming from the skin. So that is the locality discrimination. We have a condition which is known as phantom limb. A condition which is known as phantom limb. Phantom limb is a condition in which the sensation of the amputated or a missing limb is still attached. So, after surgical amputation, for example, of the arm, the person is feeling pain sensation in 60 to 80% of the conditions coming from the amputated arm. It is not present in the body, but it is still present on the cerebral cortex. This is known as the phantom limb, and this is usually due to what? Due to the irritation of the afferent fibers arising from the amputated limb. There is also something which is called the phantom sensation that may occur after removal of other body parts, like the dissection or amputation of the breast, extraction of a tooth, or removal of an eye. These areas is going to produce a phantom sensation. The subject is still feeling pain coming from these amputated areas. So we have a condition which is known as a phantom limb. Cortical plasticity. So we are going to understand what is the meaning of the cortical plasticity. Cortical plasticity means the brain can change itself. The brain can change its map. The definition of the neuroplasticity, it is the ability of the brain to reorganize itself by forming new neural connection throughout life. The ability of the brain to rearrange or reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. For example, if a digit is amputated, the cortical representation of the neighboring digits spreads into the cortical area that was formerly occupied by the amputated digit. So what's going? The digit is absent. What's going? The near area of the representing the other digits is going to expand and increase and take the place of this amputated digit. Conversely, if the cortical area representing a digit is removed, the somato-sensory map of the digit moves to the surrounding cortex. This means that if you have removing the area of a digit from the cerebral cortex, what's going? This neurons or the somato-sensory map is going to reorganize itself to be located in another area of the cerebral cortex. The explanation of this shifts appears to be the cortical connection of the sensory unit to the sensory cortex have extensive convergence and divergence, with connection that can become weak with disuse and strong with use. This means that the neurons present in the cerebral cortex have extensive convergence and divergence and have the ability to rearrange themselves to remap the areas according to the use. The part which is used, there is excessive convergence, there is excessive plasticity, there is excessive formation of new synapses, there is formation of new axons and new dendrites, while the area which with less use, there is something which is called less plasticity in this area. So the definition of plasticity, it is the ability of the brain to reorganize itself or rearrange itself to what? To produce new neural connections throughout life. Now we are going to move to the somatic sensory pathways. The sensory pathways of the somatic sensation include the dorsal column medial lemniscus system and the anterolateral system. The dorsal column medial lemniscus system concerned with the transmission of fine touch, vibration, and proprioceptive sense, while the anterolateral system is concerned with the transmission of tickling, crude touch sensation, thermal sensation, and pain sensation. Some of the pain impulses can be either conducted through the anterolateral system and through the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. About what? About the degree of localization. About it is variable according to the degree of localization of the pressure sensation. Dorsal column medial lemniscus system. The sensory pathway concerned with the transmission of the fine touch, proprioceptive sensation, and vibration is the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. It consists from three order neuron. The first order neuron is arising from the receptors, and the cell bodies of the afferent neurons are located in the dorsal root ganglia. The central branch enter into the spinal cord and ascend directly in the dorsal column in gracile and cuneate tract. Gracile carry sensation below thoracic 6, cuneate carry sensation above thoracic 6, and these tracts terminates in the dorsal column nuclei, gracile and cuneate nuclei. Second order neuron arising from the gracile and cuneate nuclei cross to the opposite side and ascend on the opposite side as what? As the medial lemniscus. This medial lemniscus terminates in the thalamus in the postroventral nucleus of the thalamus. From the postroventral nucleus of the thalamus, the fibers or the third order neuron fibers pass to the primary somatic sensory area, which is located in the postcentral gyrus. That is the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. If we go to the sensation carried by the dorsal column medial lemniscus system, we have the first one, which is the vibration sense. Vibration sense is a certain type of mechanoreceptive sensation that is require a rapid and a repetitive stimulus. This rapid and repetitive stimulus is known as the vibration sense. The receptors include Bassinian corpuscles that can respond up to 700 cycles per second and Meissner corpuscles that can respond to up to 200 cycles per second. So they are stimulated by rapid and repetitive stimuli with high frequency. Type of sensation carried by the dorsal column medial lemniscus system, including the proprioceptive sensation. The proprioceptive sensation is a conscious perception of the position of the different parts of the body in relation to each other during rest and movement. Conscious perception of the position of different parts of the body in relation to each other during rest and movement. You are sitting now listening to the lecture and you identify completely the position of your head in relation to the neck, in relation to the trunk, your limbs in relation to your trunk. You can identify easily without looking. This is the proprioceptive sensation. We classify them into the sense of position during rest and sense of movement. You can feel the position of the different parts of the body during movement. So the proprioceptive sensation are carried by the dorsal column medial lemniscus system to the cerebral cortex, and it is classified into the sense of position and sense of movement. Pathways. As we mentioned, the dorsal column medial lemniscus system is concerned with the conscious pathway of the proprioceptive sensation, but we have another pathway which is a subconscious pathway to the cerebellum via the spinocerebellar tracts, and these pathways are critical for posture, balance and coordination of skilled movement. To increase the role of the cerebellum in regulation of posture, balance and coordination of the voluntary movement, the cerebellum should receive a copy from the proprioceptive sensation. So let us go to discuss the functional anatomy of the dorsal spinocerebellar tract and the cuneo-cerebellar tract. Dorsal spinocerebellar tracts and cuneo-cerebellar tracts. We have two tracts for the subconscious pathway of the proprioceptive sensation. The first one is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, carrying the proprioceptive sensation to the cerebellum from the trunk and lower extremity. The proprioceptors charge their impulses through the afferent neurons, entering into the spinal cord and terminating or synapsing with the nucleus dorsalis of Clark at the tip of the dorsal horn. Axons of the nucleus dorsalis will ascend in the lateral column will ascend in the lateral column to reach to the medulla oblongata and enter the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That is the functional anatomy of the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, carrying subconscious proprioceptive information from the trunk and lower extremity, while the proprioceptive information from the upper limb and neck will be carried by the cuneo-cerebellar tract. We have here some of the fibers ascending in the cognate tract. We have some of the fiber ascending in the fasciculus cognatus will go to the accessory cognate nucleus, and from the accessory cognate nucleus, the second order neuron will arise and enter the cerebellum as a cuneo-cerebellar tract, will enter the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle as cuneo-cerebellar tract. So that is the spinocerebellar tract carrying the subconscious proprioceptive information to the cerebellum to inform the cerebellum about the position of the body and during rest and movement to help in the regulation of posture, equilibrium and coordination of voluntary movements. The lesion which affect the dorsal column medial meniscus system is tabes dorsalis. Tabes dorsalis occur as a complication of the venereal disease known as syphilis. It is a manifestation of neurosyphilis, and the essential lesion in tabes dorsalis is a constrictive fibrosis, and this usually present around the spinal dorsal roots, at their point of entry into the spinal cord. Around the spinal dorsal roots at their point of entry into the spinal cord central to the dorsal root ganglia. This will produce degeneration of the dorsal root fibers. Especially the mechanoreceptive fibers which ascend in the dorsal column, as well as fibers which carry pain sensation. If we go to the manifestation of tabes dorsalis, there is loss of pain sensation due to compression of the A delta fibers carrying fast pain, due to compression and degeneration of the A delta fibers carrying fast pain, and this will be associated with loss of pain in the region supplied by the degenerated pain fibers. The second manifestation that is present in tabes dorsalis is the sensory ataxia, and the sensory ataxia means inability of the subject to produce coordinated voluntary movement. One of the manifestations of this sensory ataxia is the Romberg sign, and the subject with Romberg sign, when standing with eyes closed, there is inability to maintain equilibrium and there is tendency to fall down. So the subject cannot control his equilibrium with closed eyes, as you deprive him from the role of vision in maintenance of equilibrium, as well as the loss of proprioceptive information. There is loss of equilibrium. Then we have loss of reflex action, damage of the afferent neurons that's entering into the dorsal horn to initiate the reflex action. Reflex action produced by somatic reflexes and autonomic reflexes, there will be lost. So the flexor withdrawal reflex lost. There is hyporeflexia in tendon jerk and hypotonia decrease in the muscle tone, and if the lesion extends to affect the sacral segment bilaterally, there will be loss of the autonomic reflexes like micturition, defecation and erection reflexes. There will be loss of the autonomic reflexes like micturition, defecation, and erection reflexes. So the manifestation of tabes dorsalis will include loss of pain sensation, and there is loss of the proprioceptive sensation, as well as there is loss of the reflex action. Loss of reflex action. Somato-sensory cortex, or the sensory areas in the cerebral cortex. Number one, primary somatic sensory area. The primary somatic sensory area located in the post-central gyrus behind the central sulcus. This is known as the primary somatic sensory area. Previously, according to Brodmann's classification, it is named as area 3, 1, and 2. According to the Brodmann's classification, it is named as 3, 1, and 2. But recently, Brodmann's area 3B is considered the primary somatic sensory area. The area 3B now is considered the primary somatic sensory area. Why? It receives dense inputs from the posteroventral nucleus of the thalamus. It receives dense inputs from the posteroventral nucleus of the thalamus. Also, its neurons are very responsive to somatosensory stimuli. Its neurons are very responsive to somatosensory stimuli. And its region impair somatic sensation. Its regions impair somatic sensation. And lastly, when we produce electrical stimulation of the area 3B, it evokes somatic sensory experiences. It evokes somatic sensory experiences. So previously, the somatic sensory area 1, or the primary somatic sensory area, was 3, 1, and 2. But recently, we now confine or localize the primary somatic sensory area to the area B. Why? It receives extensive or dense input from the posteroventral nucleus of the thalamus. Its neurons are highly responsive to the sensory stimuli. Its lesion produce marked somatic impairment, and when we stimulate it by electrodes, it will produce somatic sensory experiences. But what about the other areas, the area 3A, 1, and 2? What are their rules? The other cortical areas which is present or surround the area 3B has a role in the process of somatic sensation. For example, area 3A receives also input from the thalamus. However, this region is concerned with the sense of position rather than touch. So the area 3A receives inputs from the thalamus and more concerned with the sense of position rather than touch. Area 1 and 2 receives dense input from area 3B, and the projection from 3B to area A is mainly about the texture information. While the inputs or the impulses coming from area 3B to area 2 is going to send impulses about size and shape. So area 1 and 2 are receiving inputs from area 3B, and area 3B informing area 1 about texture and informing area 2 about size and shape. Small lesions in area 1 and or 2 produce predictable deficiencies in discrimination of texture, size, and shape. Small lesions in area 1 or 2 produce predictable deficiencies in the discrimination of texture, size, and shape. Body representation in somatic sensory area 1. The body representation in the somatic sensory area 1 is contralateral, and as you know, the body representation is present upside down. The body representation is present upside down. This means that the area for the legs and foot are present on the upper medial region of the post-central gyrus. The upper medial region of the post-central gyrus. Whereas if we look to the pelvis, trunk, arms, and hand and face are arranged sequentially. The relative size of the cortical area, the area of representation, is not dependent on the size of the part of the body, but it is dependent on the number of receptors present in this part of the body. For example, the area for the tongue and for example the thumb is greater than the area for the trunk. Why? Because of the major number of sensory receptors present in this area. As the part of the body has more sensory function, the area of representation will be wide in the cerebral cortex. So the body representation is dependent on what? Is dependent on the sensory function of the part of the body. Damage of the primary somatic sensory area 1. With damage of the primary somatic sensory area 1, there is inability to localize accurately the site of different sensation. Inability to localize accurately the site of different sensation, and also inability to perceive the minute differences in the intensity of the sensory stimuli. Inability to perceive minute differences in the intensity of sensory stimuli. Also, there is inability to recognize the shape or form of the objects or the texture of material. So there is a defect in the process of identification of the name of the objects, and this is known as stereognosis. Inability to identify the name of the object or the shape of the object or the texture of the object with closed eyes. This is known as stereognosis. So damage of the primary somatic sensory area 1 will produce inability to localize exactly the site of the stimulus, inability to differentiate between minute intensities of stimuli, inability to identify the name or the shape or the texture or the size of the object, and this is known as stereognosis. Secondary somatic sensory area. Secondary somatic sensory area. Below and behind the primary somatic sensory area, we have the secondary somatic sensory area. And the body representation in the secondary somatic sensory area is bilateral representation. Bilateral representation. This means that it responds to somato-sensory stimulation on both sides of the body. It responds to somato-sensory sensation on both sides of the body. And the damage in this area is associated with what? A defect in learning based on tactile discrimination or 2-point discrimination. Damage of the secondary somatic sensory area produce defect in learning based on tactile discrimination. What is the meaning of 2-point discrimination? 2-point discrimination means the ability of the person to perceive two stimuli or discriminate between two different stimuli applied at the same time. For example, if we apply two stimuli at the index finger with a distance between them like this, the subject can identify this as two separate stimuli. If we decrease the distance between the two stimuli, the subject is going to perceive it as one point or one stimulus. So 2-point discrimination means our ability to detect two stimuli applied at the same time as two separate points, and it is very important for the learning process in blind people that's dependent on the Braille method in learning. So the secondary somatic sensory area play a role in learning based on tactile discrimination. Then we are going to move to the association area or the somatic sensory association cortex, or we name it as the posterior parietal cortex, or the area 5 and 7 according to the Brodmann's classification, areas 5 and 7. If we go and look for its site, it is present behind the primary somatic sensory cortex, and it has a role in understanding of the meaning of somatic sensation. And if we look to the connections, it receives inputs from the primary somatic sensory areas. It receives inputs from the auditory cortex and from the visual cortex, and also it receives input from the posteroventral nucleus of the thalamus. So it has multiple inputs from the primary somatic sensory area, from the visual cortex and auditory cortex, as well as from the thalamus. And what is the rule? The rule in somatic sensation is the integration, the interpretation, the understanding of the meaning of somatic sensation, the process which is known as stereognosis. How can you, with the closed eyes, detect the name of the object, the shape of the object, the texture of the material of the object? For example, if you would like to examine the activity of the area 5 and 7, bring your brother and give him a coin in his hand. After asking him to close his eyes, give him a friendly object, an object who is friendly with, like a key or for example a pencil or something like that, and with closed eyes ask him to identify the name of the object. If he identifies the name of the object, here you examine the activity of area 5 and 7. You examine the activity of area 5 and 7, which is the stereognosis. Damage of the association area will produce a stereognosis and parietal lobe neglect. So damage of the areas 5 and 7 or the posterior parietal cortex will lead to a stereognosis, which means the inability of the subject to identify the name of the object or the size of the object or texture of material of the object on the contralateral side of the body with closed eyes. This is known as a stereognosis. Inability of the subject to identify the name or texture of material or the shape of the object with closed eyes on the contralateral side of the body. The second manifestation is the parietal lobe neglect. In this condition, the patient neglects the opposite side of the body and forget that it is there and this usually observed when the person performs a motor activity. When the person performs a motor activity, he usually forgets the use of the contralateral side of his body. And this as a result of impaired motor control of the skeletal muscles of that side. Due to impaired motor control of the muscles of the opposite side of the body. And if we look for why this occurs, as you know, the parietal lobe has an important role in the understanding of the meaning of the proprioceptive information. The parietal lobe or the posterior parietal lobe has a role in the integration of the proprioceptive information from the contralateral side of the body. So loss of this function impair the performance of the voluntary movement by the opposite side of the body or by the contralateral side of the body. So that is the manifestation of the damage of area 5 and 7, a stereognosis and the parietal lobe neglect. Here we have the syndrome of the neglect syndrome. We have a patient who had a stroke in the right posterior parietal cortex and asked to copy this drawings, and if we look here, the subject was unable to reproduce many of the features on the left side of the model, so he couldn't draw it completely and neglect some of the features on the left side of the model. So damage of the association areas will produce a stereognosis and the parietal lobe neglect. At the end, thank you, and I wish you good studying.